Chapter 5 said Vandaway, cool as a cucumber. "I reckon you're mistaken, Mr. Greaves, but if you won't sell to me, I reckon I can find what I need elsewhere." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the store. I watched him go, curious about this Vandaway fellow. I had heard of him before, a notorious outlaw with a price on his head. But what was he doing in Pleasant Valley? And what was in that package he was so careful about? I decided to follow him, see where he was headed. I saddled up my horse and set out after him, keeping a safe distance. He was a skilled rider, that much was clear. He led me on a winding path through the hills until we came to a small cabin nestled in a clearing. Vandaway dismounted and went inside, still carrying that mysterious package. I crept up to the window and peered inside. There was a woman there, young and pretty, with a baby in her arms. Vandaway handed her the package, and she opened it eagerly. It was filled with money, stacks and stacks of it. My heart sank. This was bad news. Vandaway was clearly up to no good, and now he had the means to carry out his plans. I knew I had to do something, but what? I pondered my next move as I rode back to town. It was clear that I needed to warn the sheriff, but how would I convince him to take action? I knew that Vandaway was a slippery character with many friends and allies in high places. But I was determined to see justice done, no matter what the cost. And so began my quest to bring Vandaway to justice, a quest that would take me across the wilds of the West and into the heart of darkness itself. It was a perilous journey filled with danger and uncertainty, but I knew that I had to see it through for the sake of all who called Pleasant Valley home. The young man spoke up confidently, tossing several gold 20s onto the bar with a resounding ring. "Why not? This is a store, isn't it? I need a cinch strap." Greaves, who had been looking particularly sour that morning, had caught my attention for the past 2 days. He hadn't slept much, as my bed was located behind the store, and I had heard men coming in at night for long conversations with him. Whatever was happening, it clearly wasn't pleasing him. I figured that young Vandaway wasn't exactly a sight for sore eyes either, but Greaves paid him no attention whatsoever. It was as if he hadn't even heard him ask for a cinch strap. I stayed inside the store, observing the various men I recognized from around town. There were a couple of card games going on, and of course plenty of drinking. It was evident that the general atmosphere wasn't friendly towards Colin Vandaway. He noticed it too, but he didn't leave. Between you and me, I had taken a liking to him and was keeping a close eye on him, without seeming to, of course. I reckon everyone else did the same, but it wasn't obvious. It was as if Vandaway hadn't been there, but you knew it wasn't the same. That's when I got the hunch that the crowd was made up of sheepmen or their friends. The previous day I had heard a lot of talk about this young Vandaway and why he had come to Pleasant Valley, as well as his reputation as a bad hombre. When I saw him, I had to admit that he looked the part. Before long, 2 more men walked in, and I recognized them both, though I wasn't exactly pleased about it. The first was your father's Mexican foreman, Lorenzo, and the other was Sim Bruce. I don't have no interest in running nobody off the range. Bruce didn't seem satisfied with the answer. "That ain't what I heard. I heard you was aiming to start trouble with us." Vandaway remained calm. "I ain't looking for trouble. I'm just trying to do right by my father's business." Bruce took a step closer, his hand on his gun. "Well, we don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and trying to tell us what to do. So if you're smart, you'll turn tail and head back where you came from." Vandaway didn't flinch. "I ain't going nowhere. I got a job to do, and I aim to do it." There was a tense silence in the saloon as the 2 men stared each other down. It was clear that Bruce was looking for a fight, but Vandaway wasn't taking the bait. Finally, Bruce spat on the ground and turned to leave. "We'll be keeping an eye on you, Vandaway. Don't you forget it." As he walked out, the tension dissipated and the other patrons went back to their drinks and conversations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. "The work depends on what happens," Bruce said, his face turning red. He shook a strong hand in front of Vandaway. "I'll tell you this, my Nez Perce Vandaway," he continued, struggling for more breath. Greaves spoke up. "Sim, I sure reckon that Nez Perce handle will stick." The crowd laughed. Bruce continued. "I'll tell you this, Nez Perce. There's been enough happening already to run you out of Arizona." "Well, you don't say. What, for instance?" Vandaway asked, quick and sarcastic. Bruce became angry and started puffing and spitting. "What, for instance? Huh. Why, you darn half-breed, you'll get run out for making up to Ellen Jorth. That won't go in this country, not for any Vandewey. You're a liar, called Vandewey. Like a big cat, he dropped off the counter. I heard his moccasins pat softly on the floor. I knew he was as dangerous as he was quick, but his voice and looks didn't change even a little. I'm not a liar, yelled Bruce. I'll make you eat that. I can prove what I say. You were seen with Ellen Jorth up on the rim day before yesterday. You were watched. You were with her. You made up to her. You grabbed her and kissed her. And I'm here to say, Nez Perce, that you're a marked man on this range. Who saw me? Asked Vandewey, calm and cold. I saw then that he had turned white in the face. You can't lie out of it, hollered Bruce, waving his hands. We've got you dead to rights. Lorenzo saw you, followed you, watched you. Bruce pointed at the grinning greaser. Lorenzo is Colonel Jorth's foreman. He saw you mauling Ellen Jorth. And when he tells the Colonel and Tad Jorth and Jackson Jorth... Ha, ha, ha. Well, hell would be a cooler place for you than this, Tonto. Greaves and his gang had come around, tickled to their guts at this mess. However, they were Texans enough to keep to one side in case Vandewey started any action. Vandewey took a look at Lorenzo, then with one swift grab he jerked the little greaser off his feet and pulled him close. Lorenzo stopped grinning and began to look a little sick, but it was plain he had right on his side. You say you saw me? Demanded Vandewey. Si, senor, replied Lorenzo. What did you see? I see senor and senorita. I hide by Manzanita. I see senorita like grande senor Vermouch. She like senor Kesey. She... Then Vandewey hit the little greaser with a backhanded crack in the mouth. Sure it was a crack. Lorenzo went over the counter backward and landed like a packload of wood, and he didn't get up. Mr. Bruce, said Vandewey, and you fellas who heard that lying greaser, I did meet Ellen Jorth, and I lost my head. I kissed her. But it was an accident. I meant no insult. I apologized. I tried to explain my crazy action. That was all. The greaser lied. Ellen Jorth was kind enough to show me the trail. We talked a little. Then I suppose because she was young, pretty, and sweet, I lost my head. She was absolutely innocent. That damned greaser told a bare-faced lie when he said she liked me. The fact was she despised me. She said so. And when she learned I was Colin Vandewey, she turned her back on me and walked away. At this point in his narrative, the old man halted as if to impress Ellen not only with what had just been told, but particularly with what was to follow. The reciting of this tale had evidently given Sprague an unconscious pleasure. He glowed. He carried a secret that he seemed desperate to reveal, and Ellen was in suspense, waiting for the end. She pleaded with Sprague to hurry up. Well, I wish I could skip the next chapter and only have the last to tell, replied the old man, placing a heavy but caring hand on hers. Sim Bruce laughed loudly. Say, Nez Perce, he said insolently, we're two good sheepmen here to have the wool pulled over our eyes. We know what you meant by Ellen Jorth, but you weren't smart when you told her you were Colin Vandewey. Haw-haw. Vandewey looked surprised, wondering if he had heard right or if they had come to the same conclusion he had. He decided to confirm. Why wasn't I smart? He asked. You weren't smart if you were aiming to be one of Ellen Jorth's lovers, said Bruce leeringly. For if you hadn't given yourself away, you could have been her lover easily enough. There was no mistaking Bruce's meaning, and some of the men laughed when he spoke. Vandewey looked from one man to another, then faced Greaves. Greaves, this drunken Bruce is excuse enough for a showdown. I take it that you are sheepmen, and you're going on Jorth's side of the fence in the matter of this sheep ranging. Well, Nez Perce, I reckon you hit the nail on the head, said Greaves dryly, spreading his big hands to the other men as if to say that the game was up. All right, you're Jorth's backers. Does anyone have a word to say in Ellen Jorth's defense? I tell you the Mexican lied. Whether you believe me or not doesn't matter. As the conversation turned towards Ellen Jorth, Bruce began to make insinuations about her reputation. Some of the men laughed, but the room grew tense. Vandewey appeared uncomfortable, fidgeting with his collar and glaring with fiery eyes. Greaves tried to distance himself from the argument, washing his hands of the situation. I don't involve myself with women, let alone a wildcat like Jorth's girl, he said in a cold, thick voice. Bruce should know her, though. From what he says, Ellen Jorth has been his girl for 2 years. Vandewey's attention turned to Bruce, and the room fell silent. Say that to me, he shouted. She's my girl, and that's why I'm going to have you run off this range. Vandeweghe lunged at Bruce, calling him a damned drunken cur and a vile-mouthed liar. The sound of Vandeweghe's fist hitting Bruce's face echoed like an axe hitting a slab of meat. Bruce fell to the ground, bloodied and missing several teeth. As Bruce staggered to his feet, Vandeweghe warned the rest of Greaves's crew not to interfere. "If any of you make a move, it'll mean gunplay," he said. No one moved. Vandeweghe struck Bruce again, knocking him across the room and into the counter. The sound of Bruce's pained screams filled the air. Vandeweghe was lightning fast, and no one could keep up with him. He jumped over the counter just as Bruce fell back on it. With Greaves's gang in front of him, he punched Bruce left and right and slammed his head on the counter. When Bruce went limp and fell to the floor, Vandeweghe let him drop. He jumped back over the counter and wiped the blood off his hands before throwing his kerchief on Bruce's face. Bruce wasn't dead or seriously injured, but he was moaning and drooling. Vandeweghe kicked him with disgust and turned to face the crowd. "Greaves, that's what I think of your sim, Bruce. Tell him next time he sees me to run or pull a gun," he said, grabbing his rifle and package from the counter. He didn't even look back as he mounted his horse and rode away. Ellen could only say goodbye, her voice almost inaudible. She ran to her burrow, tears blurring her vision and her fingers shaking. She had to get away from herself, from this unknown creature that was Ellen Jorth. She sobbed as she dragged the burro down the canyon trail, unable to escape her thoughts or deny her feelings. The story had taken too long, and every minute had torn her apart. It felt like everything had ended for her. Ellen Jorth arrived at her father's ranch, known as the Knoll, around noon that day. The ranch was located at the meeting point of 3 canyons, which formed a larger one. The Knoll was a symmetrical hill covered in brush, cedars, and lichened rocks. The bleached grass on the hill was dotted with rocks that occasionally peeked out from under the vegetation. Below the knoll was a wide, grassy flat or meadow, where a willow-bordered stream flowed through its rugged, boulder-strewn bed. The water was abundant during this season, with deep washes leading down from the slopes indicating cloudbursts and heavy storms. The meadow valley was home to horses and cattle and curved away between the timbered slopes before disappearing into the greenery. One unique feature of this canyon was that the slope facing northwest was heavily covered in spruce trees, while the opposite slope, exposed to the sun and therefore less snowbound in winter, held a sparse growth of yellow pines. However, Ellen's arrival at the knoll marked the death of her girlhood. The veil of maiden mystery that she had only vaguely instinctively guessed was suddenly and violently ripped aside. The barren, sordid truth of her life was now seen by her enlightened eyes. She had come to know the bitter realization of the vileness of men from her clan, in stark contrast to the manliness and chivalry of an enemy. The hard facts of unalterable repute, as created by slander and fostered by low minds, were now clear to her. All these forces acted together in a cataclysm that had caught her heart, whirling her through immense and agonizing changes, and bringing her face to face with reality. They forced upon her suspicion and doubt of all she had trusted, warning her of the dark, impending horror of a tragic, bloody feud. And lastly, these forces taught her the supreme truth, at once so glorious and so terrible that she could not escape the doom of womanhood. The ranch house of Colonel Jorth was nestled around the bend of the largest of the 3 canyons. It was well hidden so as not to detract from the beauty of the serene meadow valley. The log cabins that made up the ranch were run down and squalid with black mud holes of corrals. Ellen Jorth approached her home slowly, with dragging, reluctant steps. She had never been happy there, but today it seemed even worse. The ranch appeared bare, uncared for, and repugnant to her. She now saw it with clarified eyes. Ellen's cabin was a single-room structure with no windows and only one door. It was about 20 feet square. The huge, ragged stone chimney had been built on the outside, with the wide-open fireplace set inside the logs. Smoke was rising from the chimney. As Ellen unpacked her burro, she heard the loud, lazy laughter of men. An adjoining log cabin had been built in 2 sections, with a wide-roofed hall or space between them. The door in each cabin faced the other, and there was a tall man standing in one. Ellen recognized Daggs, a neighbor sheepman. He evidently spent more time with her father than at his own home, wherever that was. Ellen had never seen it. She heard Daggs drawl, "Jorth, here's your kid come home." Ellen carried her bed inside the cabin and unrolled it upon a couch built of boughs in the far corner. She had forgotten Colin Van de Wege's package, and now it fell out under her sight. Quickly she covered it. A Mexican woman, a relative of Antonio and the only servant about the place, was squatting Indian fashion before the fireplace, stirring a pot of beans. She and Ellen did not get along well together, and few words ever passed between them. Ellen had hung a canvas curtain across a small corner of the cabin to give herself a bit of privacy. She didn't have many possessions, just a crude table she had made herself that held a walnut-framed mirror, a brush and comb, and an old ebony cabinet filled with odds and ends that made her feel a bit sorry for herself. Under the table was an old leather trunk that had belonged to her mother, filled with clothing and other belongings. Her wardrobe hung on pegs above the couch, and a tiny shelf held a few well-worn books. Her father slept on a couch in the opposite corner when he stayed indoors, which wasn't very often. Supplies and utensils were stored in a rude cupboard next to the fireplace, and a crude table and benches stood closer to the door. The cabin was dark and smelled of smoke, old cooked meals, and musty timber. Sunlight streamed in through gaps in the roof where shingles had split or weathered. A strip of bacon hung on one side of the cupboard and a haunch of venison on the other. Ellen couldn't stand the dirty Mexican woman who lived with them. When Ellen returned after being away, she immediately set to work cleaning and tidying up the cabin, which had become quite unkempt. The Mexican woman slouched away to her own quarters outside, leaving Ellen to enjoy the satisfaction of her labor. As she worked, Ellen heard the sounds of men, horses, and cattle outside, but she was left undisturbed for a long while. The doorway was suddenly darkened by a tall figure. "Hey there, little one," drawled a lazy voice. "So you made it home?" Ellen looked up to see a man with a superbly built physique leaning against the doorpost. Like most Texans, he had light hair and light eyes, but his face was tough and lined. His long, sandy mustache hung low and covered his mouth. Wearing spurs, boots, and a belt with a heavy gun on his hip, he gave Ellen a new impression of him. She felt like she was seeing everything in a strange light. "Hello, Dags," Ellen replied. "Where's my dad?" "He's playing cards with Jackson and Jordan," Dags answered. "He's not doing too well, and it's getting to his head." "Gambling?" asked Ellen. "My dear child, when has Colonel Jorth ever played for fun?" Dags laughed lazily. "There's a stack of gold on the table. I reckon your Uncle Jackson will win it. Jordan's out of luck." Dags stepped inside, his long spurs clinking as he moved. He put his hand on Ellen's shoulder in a rather compelling way. "Hey there, my gal, give me a kiss," he said. "Dags, I'm not your girl," Ellen replied, slipping out from under his hand. But Dags put his arm around her in an indolent, affectionate way that was both bold and self-contained. Ellen had to struggle to get free of him, and when she finally put the table between them, she looked him square in the eyes. "Dags, keep your paws off me," she said firmly. "Now, Ellen, I'm not a bear," Dags protested. "What's the matter, kid?" "I'm not a kid, and there's nothing the matter," Ellen said. "Just keep your hands to yourself, that's all." Dags tried to reach across the table to her, but his movements were slow and lazy, just like his smile. "Come on, my dear, you sat on my knee just the other day, didn't you?" he coaxed. Ellen's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I was a child," she retorted. "Now listen to this grown-up young woman." In just a few days, everything had changed. "Don't be angry, Ellen," he said, trying to placate her. "Come on, give me a kiss." She looked into his eyes, which were clear and hard like an eagle's, but lacked the intelligence to understand her. This moment separated Ellen from him and his kind. "Dags, I was just a child," she said. "I was lonely and hungry for affection. I was innocent. Then I became careless and thoughtless when I should have known better. But I hardly understood you men. I put those thoughts out of my mind. But now I know what you meant and what you've made people believe about me." "I get your point," he replied, his tone changing. "But I did ask you to marry me. Yes, you did, the first day you came to my dad's house, and you asked me to marry you after you found out you couldn't have your way with me. To you, one didn't mean any more than the other." "Well, I did more than Sim, Bruce, and Jordan," he retorted. "They never asked you to marry them." "No, they didn't, and if I could respect them at all, I would, because they didn't ask me." "Well, I'll be damned," Dags said thoughtfully as he stroked his mustache. "I'll say to them what I've said to you," Ellen continued. "I'll tell Dad to make you leave me alone. I wouldn't marry one of you loafers to save my life. I have my suspicions about you. You're a bad lot." Daggs changed subtly. The nonchalant demeanor of the man vanished in an instant. "Miss Jorth, are you saying we're a bad lot of sheepmen?" he asked coolly in the Texan drawl. "No," Ellen replied. "I'm not saying sheepmen." "You're a sorry bunch," Ellen spat out. Daggs responded as if he were talking to a man. "Oh, do you think so?" He then spun on his heel and left. Outside, he bumped into Ellen's father. Ellen overheard Daggs say, "Lee, your wildcat is here, and mark my words, someone has been talking to her." Her father, with a husky voice that signaled he had been drinking, asked, "Who has?" "Lord knows," Daggs replied, "but I can tell you it wasn't anyone friendly to us." Jorth resignedly said, "We can't control people's tongues." "I'm not so sure," Daggs chuckled. "I've never heard dead men's tongues wagging." The sound of his spurs faded away. Ellen's father then walked into the cabin. When he saw her, his dark, moody face brightened. Ellen knew she was the only person left in the world that he loved. Even as their misfortunes piled up and he slipped away from better days, Ellen loved him more. "Hello, my Ellen?" He embraced her. When he had been drinking, he never kissed her. "I'm glad you're home. This place is bad enough, but when you're gone, it's even worse. I'm hungry." Ellen laid food and drink on the table. She avoided looking at him directly. She was afraid of the new searching power of her eyes in relation to him. Lee Jorth had been a handsome man, but now his dark hair was streaked with gray and white. His face was sallow and thin with deep lines. Underneath his round brown eyes, like deadened furnaces, were blue, swollen welts. The man had a sour expression and a weak chin, which was only partially hidden by his gray mustache and pointed beard. He wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, both of which were black and so old and worn that they clearly came from Texas. Jorth always wore a white linen shirt, a remnant of his former southern wealth, which was now ragged and dirty. Ellen watched her father eat and waited for him to speak. She found it strange that he never asked about the sheep or the newly born lambs. She had a feeling that he didn't care about them at all. "Ellen, what made Daggs so angry?" her father asked. He was really fired up. Years ago, Ellen had told her father about a man who had mistreated her. Her father had nearly killed the man. Since then, Ellen had kept her problems to herself. If her father had not been so self-absorbed, he would have seen many things that would have inflamed his southern pride and temper. "Daggs asked me to marry him again, but I told him he was part of a bad group," she replied. Jorth laughed scornfully. "Fool, my God, Ellen, I must have failed you if every sheep rancher who comes along thinks he can marry you." At the pause in his speech, Ellen lowered her eyes. Little things that she once ignored now had a significant meaning to her. "It's okay, Dad," she said. "They can't marry me." "Daggs said someone has been talking to you. What about that?" "Old John Sprague just returned from Pleasant Valley," Ellen said. "I stopped by to see him. He told me all the gossip in town." "Anything interesting?" her father asked darkly. "Yes, Dad, I'm afraid there is," she replied hesitantly. Ellen had made a decision to tell Jorth about the rumored war between sheepmen and cattlemen. She informed him that old Van de Weghe had Blaisdell, Gordon, Fredericks, Blue, and other prominent ranchers on his side. She also told him that Van de Weghe's son Colin had come from Oregon with a reputation as a fighter, scout, and tracker. Ellen added that Colonel Lee Jorth was at the head of the sheepmen and that a violent conflict was inevitable. Jorth responded with a hint of anger in his sallow cheek. "Ha! Reckon none of that is news to me. I knew all that." Ellen wondered if he had heard of her encounter with Colin Van de Weghe. If not, she knew that Sim Bruce and Lorenzo would inform him. She decided to beat them to it. "Dad, I met Colin Van de Weghe. He came into my camp and asked the way to the rim. I showed him and we talked a little. It was clear that we were getting acquainted when he told me who he was. I then left him and hurried back to camp." Jorth responded, "Jordan met Van de Weghe down in the woods. He said he looked like an Indian, a hard and slippery customer to reckon with." Ellen replied dryly, "I guess I can endorse what Jordan said." She could have laughed at her deceit, but she had not lied. Jorth then asked, "How did this young Van de Weghe strike you?" Ellen felt a slow, sickening, guilty rise of blood in her face. She was helpless to stop it, but her father, who was looking at her without seeing her, did not notice. "He struck me as different from the men here," she stammered. "Did Sprague tell you about this half-Indian Vandeweghe and his reputation?" Jorth asked. "Yes," Ellen responded. "Did he look like a real woodsman to you?" Jorth inquired. "Indeed he did. He wore buckskin. He stepped quickly and softly. He acted at home in the woods. He had eyes black as night and sharp as lightning," Ellen replied. "They sure saw about all there was to see," Jorth mumbled as he chewed on his mustache, lost in thought. "Dad, tell me, is there going to be a war?" Ellen asked. Jorth's eyes blazed with a red, strange, rolling flash, and his body jerked. "Sure. You might as well know," he replied. "Between sheepmen and cattlemen?" Ellen continued. "Yes," Jorth confirmed. "With you, Dad, at the head of one faction and Sito Vandeweghe leading the other?" Ellen asked. "Daughter, you have it correct so far as you go," Jorth responded. "Oh, Dad, can't this fight be avoided?" Ellen pleaded. "You forget you're from Texas," Jorth reminded her. "Can't it be helped?" Ellen stubbornly repeated. "No," Jorth declared with deep, hoarse passion. "Why not?" Ellen asked. "Well, we sheepmen are going to run sheep anywhere we like on the range, and cattlemen won't stand for that," Jorth explained. "But, Dad, it's so foolish," Ellen said earnestly. "You sheepmen don't have to run sheep over the cattle range." "I reckon we do," Jorth replied. "Dad, that argument doesn't make sense. I know the country. For years to come there will be room for both sheep and cattle without overrunning. If some of the range is better in water and grass, then whoever got there first should have it. That's only fair. It's common sense, too," Ellen argued. "Ellen, I reckon some cattle people have been prejudicing you," Jorth accused bitterly. "Dad!" Ellen cried hotly. This had become an ordeal for Jorth. He seemed like a victim of contending tides of feeling. Suddenly some will or struggle broke within him, and the change was visible. Haggard, shifty-eyed, with a wobbling chin, he burst into speech. "See here, girl, you listen. There's a clique of ranchers down in the basin, all those you named, with Vandeweghe at their head. They have resented sheepmen coming down into the valley. They want it all to themselves, that's the reason. Sure, there's another. All the Vandeweghes are crooked. They're cattle and horse thieves. They have been for years. Sito Vandeweghe always was a maverick rustler. He's getting old now, and he's rich, so he wants to cover his tracks. He plans to blame this cattle rustling and horse stealing on us sheepmen and run us out of the country." Ellen Jorth studied her father's face gravely, her newly found truth-seeing power not failing her. Perhaps he was telling lies, or maybe in his brooding over his failures and troubles, he leaned towards false judgments. Despite her keen determination to know, fearfully she believed she was coming to some revelation and found herself shrinking. "Dad, Mother told me before she died that the Vandeweghes had ruined you," said Ellen, her voice low. It hurt her to see her father cover his face, making it hard for her to continue. "If they ruined you, they ruined all of us. I know what we had once, what we lost again and again, and I see what we have come to now. Mother hated the Vandeweghes. She taught me to hate the very name. But I never knew how they ruined you, or why or when, and I want to know now." Jorth's face changed as he disclosed the truth. He lived in the past, forgetting the present. He even seemed younger, with a revivifying flash of hate making his face radiant. Hate gave him back the spirit of his youth. "Sito Vandeweghe and I were boys together in Weston, Texas," began Jorth, his voice swift and passionate. "We went to school together. We loved the same girl, your mother. When the war broke out, she was engaged to Vandeweghe. His family was rich and they had a lot of influence, but she loved me. When Vandeweghe went to war, she married me. He came back and faced us. Goodness gracious, I'll never forget that. Your mother admitted her unfaithfulness, by God. She even taunted him with it. Vandeweghe accused me of winning her over with lies, but she took the sting out of that. Vandeweghe never forgave her, and he hounded me to ruin. He made me out to be a card sharp, cheating my best friends. I was disgraced. Later he tangled me in the courts, beat me out of property, and finally, by convicting me of rustling cattle, he ran me out of Texas." Jorth's face was now black and distorted, a sight that made Ellen sick with a terrible passion of despair and hate. The truth of her father's ruin and her own were enough. What did anything else matter? Jorth beat the table with fluttering, nerveless hands that seemed all the more significant for their lack of physical force. "And so help me God, it's got to be wiped out in blood," he hissed. That was his answer to Ellen's wavering and nobility, and she had no response to give. She crept away into the corner behind the curtain and lay on her couch in the semi-darkness with a strained heart and a resurging, unconquerable tumult in her mind. She remained there from the middle of that afternoon until the next morning. When she woke up, she expected to be unable to rise and hoped she could not. But life seemed multiplied in her, and inaction was impossible. Something young, sweet, and hopeful that had been in her was now replaced by a woman's passion to learn for herself, to watch events, to meet what must come, to survive. After breakfast, during which she sat alone, she decided to put Vandewey's package out of sight so that it would not subject her to continual annoyance. The moment she picked it up, her old curiosity assailed her. "I might as well see what it is," she muttered, and with swift hands she opened the package. Ellen Jorth was surprised to find 2 pairs of fine, soft shoes and 4 pairs of stockings in her possession. The shoes were of a style she had never seen before, and 2 of the stockings were made of strong, serviceable wool, while the others had a finer texture. Ellen was amazed that these were the things she needed most, and she couldn't believe her luck. She couldn't help but touch the shoes and feel their softness and warmth. Suddenly it dawned on her that the man who gave her the shoes had seen her bare legs and felt sorry for her. Despite her initial anger, Ellen couldn't bring herself to burn the shoes. Instead, she wrapped them up and hid them in the bottom of her old trunk, intending to send them to Anne Vandewey some day. As Ellen lowered the lid, she whispered to herself, "Colin Vandewey, I hate him." She couldn't shake off the feeling that Colin had looked at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. Later that day, Ellen stepped outside carrying her rifle, which was unusual for her unless she was going into the woods. She saw a group of men lounging in front of the porch of the double cabin, and her father was pacing back and forth, talking loudly. As Ellen approached, her father stopped talking and the men relaxed their attention. Ellen quickly scanned the group before her. Daggs stood tall and proud, with a head resembling that of a hawk, basking in the sun. Jordan, on the other hand, had a lean, sand-gray face that was shrouded in secrecy. Her uncle, Jackson Jorth, was a massive, gaunt figure with a black beard and hair that contrasted sharply with the white in them. His hollow eyes glowed with a ghastly fire that sent shivers down her spine. Tad Jorth, her father's younger brother, was a weak-chinned drunkard with red eyes and nose. 3 other Texans lounged around, all partners of Daggs, sun-browned, blue-eyed, and sporting dusty high-heeled boots and broad black sombreros. They claimed to be sheepmen, but Ellen had her doubts. Rockwell's spent most of his time lurking around, waiting for a chance to waylay her. Springer was a gambler, and Queen was a silent, lazy man who never wore a glove on his right hand and always kept a gun within reach. "Howdy, Ellen. Sure you ain't going to say good mornin' to this here bad lot?" Daggs drawled in his usual sarcastic tone. "Why, sure. Good morning, you hard-working, industrious manana sheep-raisers," Ellen replied calmly, throwing them off their game. Jackson Jorth let out a gruff laugh, and some of them took off their sombreros. Rockwell's managed a lazy, polite good morning, but Ellen's father was not amused. "Ellen, I'm not liking your talk," he said, frowning. "Dad, when you play cards, don't you call a spade?" Ellen retorted. "Why, sure I do." "Well, I'm calling spades spades," she said firmly. "Aha," Jorth grunted, dropping his eyes. "Where you going with your gun? I'd rather you hung round here now," he said. "Reckon I might as well get used to packing my gun all the time," Ellen replied, determined not to back down. "I reckon they'll treat me like a man now," thought Ellen as she waited for the arrival of Sim, Bruce, and Lorenzo. The 2 men rode towards the cabin with an air of urgency, drawing the attention of the crowd away from Ellen. Daggs commented, "Sure they're bustin' with news," and another man added, "They've been riding some, you bet." Jorth, however, noted that Bruce looked strange. "Red liquor," Tad Jorth explained, referring to the brand of alcohol Greaves hands out. But Jackson Jorth noticed something else. "Nah, Sim ain't drunk. Look at his bloody shirt." The crowd's interest was piqued, and they watched as Bruce approached with a swollen, bruised face and unhealed cuts. His right eye was puffed up and dark purple, and his other eye gleamed with a hard and sullen light. Bruce stretched out a shaking hand towards Jorth and bellowed, "That Nez Perce Vandewey, he beat me half to death." Jorth was speechless, but Daggs spoke up, "Well, Sim, I'll be damned if you don't look it." Jorth demanded to know what happened, and Bruce explained that he thought Vandewey was swinging an axe, but Greaves swore it was his fists. Jorth asked why Bruce didn't use his gun, but Bruce replied, "Gun? Hell!" and flung his arms wide. He pointed to Lorenzo and said that he had a gun, but Vandeweghe got to him before Bruce had the chance. The attention then turned to Lorenzo, who had a heavy discolored swelling on the side of his face. When asked what happened, he replied, "Senor Vandeweghe, heat me ver quick. I see 1,000 stars, then mucho black all like night." Some of Daggs's men laughed, and Daggs himself smiled. The crowd was now fully engrossed in the story of the fight, and Ellen's earlier concerns were forgotten. Colonel Jorth was in no mood for humor. "Tell us what happened, quickly," he ordered. "Where did it happen? Why? Who saw it? What did you do?" Bruce became sullen and impressive. "Well, I was in Greaves's store and ran into Colin Vandeweghe. He was looking for him, and I had my mind made up about what to do, but I got to talking instead of shooting. I called him Nez Perce and threw all that talk in his face about old Cito Vandeweghe sending for him. I told him he'd get run out of the Tonto. I was just warming up when it all happened. He slugged Lorenzo, and Lorenzo slid peacefully to bed behind the counter. I didn't have time to think of throwing a gun before he attacked me. He knocked out 2 of my teeth, and I swallowed one of them." Ellen stood in the background behind 3 men and in the shadow. She did not join in the laughter that followed Bruce's remarks. She had known that he would lie, uncertain yet of her reaction to this, but more bitter and furious as he revealed his utter baseness. She waited for more to be said. "Well, I'll be darned," drawled Daggs. "What do you make of this kind of fighting?" queried Jorth. "Darn if I know," replied Daggs in perplexity. "Sure and certain it's not the way of a Texan. Maybe this young Vandeweghe really is what old Cito swears he is. Sure, Bruce ain't nothing to give an edge to a real gunfighter. Looks to me like Vandeweghe bluffed Greaves and his gang and licked your men without throwing a gun." "Maybe Vandeweghe doesn't want the name of drawing first blood," suggested Jorth. "That'd be like Cito," spoke up Rockwells quietly. "I once rode for Cito in Texas." "Say, Bruce," said Daggs, "was this palaver of yours and Colin Vandeweghe's about the old stock dispute?" "So what about your father's range and water, and specifically about sheep?" asked Daggs, his hawk-like gaze fixed on Bruce. "Well, I yelled a lot," Bruce replied hesitantly, "but I don't remember everything I said. I was angry. It was the same old argument that's been bringing us closer and closer to trouble." Daggs turned his attention away from Bruce. "Well, Jorth, all I'll say is this. If Bruce is telling the truth, we don't have much to fear from this young Vandeweghe. I've known a lot of gunfighters in my day, and Colin Vandeweghe doesn't seem to fit the bill. There's never been a gunman who would risk injuring their right hand by punching someone." "Well," Bruce interjected sullenly, "you can take it or leave it, I don't care. But my gut feeling is that Nez Perce Vandeweghe could handle any of you guys just as easily as he did me, and he's got Greaves figured out, and you all know that Greaves is deeply involved." "Shut up with that kind of talk," Jorth demanded, his voice strident, "and answer me. Was the fight in Greaves' bar about sheep?" "Aw, hell, I said it was, didn't I?" Bruce shouted, his face contorted with anger. Ellen emerged from the shadows behind the tall men who had been blocking her view. "Bruce, you're a liar," she declared sharply. Her sudden appearance stunned Bruce, who went pale except for the bruises on his face. He held his breath for a moment, then exhaled forcefully. He struggled to regain his composure, stammering incoherently. "You're not just a liar," Ellen continued, facing him with fiery eyes. She held a rifle in both hands as if to emphasize her threat. "That fight had nothing to do with sheep. Colin Vandeweghe didn't beat you up over any sheep. Old John Sprague was in Greaves' store. He heard what you said." As Bruce cowered in fear, Ellen watched him with disgust. She couldn't believe that he thought she would actually harm him. She realized that he was more afraid of her father than he was of her. Jorth was clearly confused by the situation and asked Ellen what was going on. She responded fiercely, telling him that Bruce had spread lies about her that were completely untrue. Daggs, who was standing beside Jorth, held his arm tightly, knowing that things were about to get heated. Ellen continued to berate Bruce, telling him that he had dishonored her and made her look like a fool in front of the whole town. She told him that he had made her own boyfriend lie about her, and that if she had any reputation left in Pleasant Valley, he had ruined it. Bruce tried to defend himself, saying that he was drunk and jealous, but Ellen was having none of it. She demanded that he take back everything he had said, or else she would hurt him. As she lowered the rifle toward his feet, Bruce finally relented. He apologized and took back everything he had said about Ellen. She was still seething with anger, but she knew that she had made her point. She looked over at her father, who was watching the scene with a mixture of amusement and concern. Ellen knew that she had just proven to him that she was not to be messed with. His instincts warned him of the danger that lay ahead. Daggs, with his calm and collected demeanor, took control of the situation. "Listen up," he shouted. "Ellen, I think Bruce was drunk and not in his right mind. He's apologized, and we don't need any troublemakers in this camp. Leave him be. Your father hired me to lead the Yorths, and that's the way it's going to be. Sim, you're a deceitful liar. Stay away from Ellen, or you'll have to deal with me. Jorth, maybe it's best if you forget you're a Texan for a while until you calm down. Let Bruce take some of Vandewege's bullets. The Jorth-Vandewege feud is heating up, and we should take heed of Sito's words about his Nez Perce son." Chapter 6. Ellen Yorth was determined to use every bit of her intelligence and willpower to save herself from the impending crisis. She knew that she couldn't afford to be weak or ignorant when the time came. Although dreaming and laziness had been a source of comfort for her in the past, she knew that they would be of no use when faced with the hard test that awaited her. When it came to her father's fight, she was determined to stand by him no matter what happened. But when it came to her own beliefs, her womanhood, and her soul, she knew that she was on her own. Ellen set aside her dreams and put her indolence to rest. She found many tasks to occupy her time, and when those were done, she kept herself busy in other ways. She found that the peace and balance of hard work helped her to prepare for the tough times ahead. Yorth rode out every day, sometimes with a few of his men, sometimes with a larger group. He would tell Ellen that he was visiting the neighboring ranches or the various sheep camps, but often he wouldn't return until the following day. When he returned, he reeked of rum and looked like he needed some serious rest. His horses were always covered in dust and sweat. Ellen would worry constantly until he came back. He seemed to grow darker and more haggard with each passing day, as if something terrible was about to happen. He would stay up late, talking with the men in the dimly lit cabin, where they would drink and smoke but rarely gamble. Ellen knew that when they didn't gamble, it meant that something was really bothering them. She hadn't resorted to eavesdropping yet, but she knew that she would have to soon. As the days passed, Ellen began to realize that there was something odd about her father's supposed ranch. It wasn't really a ranch at all. There was no actual ranching being done, and very little work to speak of. Ellen often had to chop wood herself, and her father didn't even own a plow. She was shocked to learn this. How could a ranch not have a plow? Even old John Sprague managed to raise some crops, but there was never any farming or livestock management going on at her father's so-called ranch. The cattle and horses suffered greatly during the winter, with many of them dying in the snow. The sheep were driven down to the basin in the fall, and Ellen had never even seen them being sheared. Ellen couldn't find any sign of a fence or any salt for the animals, and there wasn't even a wagon or a sheep-shearing outfit on the property. Her father and uncles seemed to be more interested in horse trading and buying than anything else. There were horses running loose all over the place, some of them wild as deer. Ellen couldn't keep track of them all. As the days went by, Ellen realized that there was something very wrong with her father's supposed ranch, and she knew that a crisis was coming. The many trails branching out from the Yorth ranch had a certain allure for Ellen. She became intrigued with where they led and eventually decided to explore them herself. Ellen had heard about the sheep ranch of Daggs, which was supposedly just a few miles away in Bear Canyon. However, when she went to explore it, she found nothing. This piqued her curiosity even more, and she sought out her friend Sprague for directions to Bear Canyon so she wouldn't miss it. Ellen rode from the narrow, maple-thicketed head of the canyon near the rim all the way down its length. However, she found no sign of a ranch, cabin, or corral. Sprague had told her there was only one canyon by that name, but Daggs had assured her of its exact location on his property. Ellen wondered if they had lied or if they were mistaken about the canyon. She explored all the canyons within 6 to 8 miles of her home, both to the east and west, but found only a couple of old log cabins that had long been deserted. Despite this, Ellen didn't give up on her quest. She didn't follow all the trails to their ends, but she did ride many of them into the deepest, roughest, and wildest parts of the gorge and thicket that she had ever seen. None of these trails had ever been used to drive cattle or sheep. Eventually, her father caught wind of her riding around and expected a bitter quarrel to ensue. However, he simply asked her to limit her riding to the meadow valley and promptly forgot about it. Ellen was growing increasingly concerned about her father's behavior. One moment he was distant and abstracted, the next he was nervously intense, drinking harder and giving fiercer speeches to the men. She feared this was a sign of his further deterioration and the ever-present danger of the growing feud. One morning, after being away for 2 nights, Yorth returned home with a stranger in tow. Ellen heard the sound of horses before she saw them and went outside to greet them. The stranger was a young giant with sharp features and a light fuzzy beard. He was long and loose-jointed, with the largest hands and feet Ellen had ever seen. They had brought with them a beautiful black thoroughbred horse that immediately caught Ellen's eye. Yorth proudly announced that he had traded for the horse, but it was too gentle for him and perhaps a little small for his weight. Ellen was delighted. She had never owned a good horse before, let alone one like this. Her father's only condition was that she was not to ride the horse out of the canyon. Ellen asked for the horse's name and was told it was Spades. She thought it was an odd name, but decided it was as good as any. Her father reminded her to keep the horse hobbled when she wasn't riding him, and then walked off with the stranger. Ellen couldn't wait to ride Spades and feel the wind in her hair. She knew she would take good care of him and cherish him always. Spades was covered in dust, and his fur was damp from the morning dew. His dark, intelligent eyes followed Ellen's every move as she approached him. Ellen knew how her father and his friends treated their horses, rough and careless, but as she examined Spades, she realized he had once been a pet. She took it upon herself to clean and brush him and even feed him. She then fitted a bridle to his head and saddled him up. Spades responded well to her kindness, and she mounted him. She discovered that he had the smoothest gait she had ever experienced. He followed her every command and even fell into a graceful pace on his own. Though she could tell he was ready to run at any moment, Ellen was content with his slower gaits. "Spades, you've outdone my burro Ginny," Ellen said, feeling a bit regretful. "Well, I guess women are fickle." The next day, Ellen rode up the canyon to show Spades to her friend John Sprague. When she arrived, the old burro breeder was nowhere to be found. She waited for him, leaving Spades to graze on the grass. The cabin and clearing only emphasized the wildness of the forest. Ellen had once visited Sprague often, but his talk and news always left her feeling down. As she waited, she heard hoofbeats on the trail. It was unlikely that Sprague would return from that direction, so Ellen assumed it was one of her father's herders sent to fetch her. As she caught sight of the approaching horseman down in the aspens, Ellen failed to recognize him. When he passed one of the openings, she heard his horse come to a stop. She assumed that the man had seen her, as she couldn't think of any other reason for his sudden halt. The glimpse she had of him had given her the impression that he was peering ahead in the trail, looking for tracks. Then she heard the rider come on again, more slowly this time. Eventually the horse trotted out into the opening, only to be pulled up short. Ellen recognized the buckskin-clad figure, the broad shoulders, and the dark face of Colin Vandeweghe. A strange, quaking sensation took over Ellen, which she had never experienced before. It took all of her willpower to subdue that feeling, which was new to her. Vandeweghe rode slowly across the clearing towards her, but for Ellen his approach seemed singularly swift. So swift that her surprise, dismay, conjecture, and anger obstructed her will. The outwardly calm and cold Ellen Jorth was a travesty that mocked her, and she felt that he would discern this. The moment Vandeweghe drew close enough for Ellen to see his face, she experienced a strong, shuddering repetition of her first shock of recognition. He was not the same. The light, the youth was gone. However, this did not cause her emotion. Was it not a sudden transition of her nature to the dominance of hate? Ellen seemed to feel the shadow of her unknown self standing with her. When Vandeweghe halted his horse, Ellen had been standing near the trunk of a fallen pine, and she instinctively backed against it. Her legs trembled uncontrollably. Vandeweghe took off his cap and crushed it nervously in his bare brown hand. "Good morning, Miss Ellen," he said. Ellen did not return his greeting, but instead she asked almost breathlessly, "Did you come by our ranch?" "No, I circled," he replied. "Colin Vandeweghe, what do you want here?" she demanded. "Don't you know?" he returned, his eyes intensely black and piercing. Ellen felt the piercing gaze of Colin Vandeweghe as if he were searching her very soul. she could only sustain the ordeal of meeting his eyes with her rousing fury. She wanted to make a scornful allusion to his half-breed Indian traits and the reputation that had preceded him, but she held her tongue. "No," she replied firmly. "It's hard to call a woman a liar," he retorted bitterly, "but you must be seeing you're a Jorth." "Liar, not to you, Colin Vandeweghe," she shot back. "I'd not lie to you to save my life." He studied her with keen, sober, moody intent. The dark fire of his eyes thrilled her. "If that's true, I'm glad," he said. "Sure it's true. I've no idea why you came here," Ellen replied, though a dawning idea was beginning to take shape in her mind. She couldn't admit it to herself, though, or she would fail in the contempt and scorn and fearlessness she was trying to project. "Does old Sprague live here?" asked Vandeweghe. "Yes, I expect him back soon. Did you come to see him?" "No." "Did Sprague tell you anything about the row he saw me in?" "He did not," Ellen lied with stiff lips, surprised at herself. She had sworn she couldn't lie, but now all her conscious will seemed impelled to deceive. What did she have to hide from Colin Vandeweghe? And yet a still small voice reminded her of the Ellen Jorth who had waited for him that day, who had spied upon him, who had treasured a gift she could not destroy, who had hugged to her miserable heart the fact that he had fought for her name. "I'm glad of that," Vandeweghe said thoughtfully. "Did you come here to see me?" Ellen couldn't bear the repeated suggestion of fineness and consideration in him. She felt like she would betray herself, reveal what she didn't even realize herself. She had to find a way to create conflict between the Jorths and Vandeweghes. "I swear I didn't, Miss Ellen," he said humbly. "I'll explain why I came later, but it wasn't to see you, although I won't deny that I wanted to. But that's not important. You didn't meet me on the rim that day." "Meet you?" she repeated coldly. "Of course you didn't expect me." "I don't know how, but I did," he answered, looking directly into her eyes. "I left something in your tent that day. Did you find it?" "Yes," she answered with the same emotionless tone. "And I kicked it out, of course." She saw him flinch. "And you didn't open it?" "Of course not," she said, as if she had no choice. "Don't you know anything about people? Even if you are a Vandeweghe, you weren't born in Texas." "Thank God for that," he replied. "I was born in a beautiful land with green meadows, deep forests, and white rivers, not in a barren desert where men live as dry and hard as cactus. Where I come from, men don't live on hate. They can forgive." "Forgive?" she scoffed. "Could you forgive a Jorth?" "Yes, I could." "It's easy to say that when all the wrongs are on your side," she said bitterly. "Ellen Jorth, the first wrong was on your side," Colin said, his voice low. "Your father stole my father's sweetheart with lies, slander, dishonor, and making terrible love to her in his absence." "That's a lie!" Ellen cried passionately. "It's not," he said solemnly. "Colin Vandeweghe, you're lying," she shouted. "No, I'm telling you the truth. Your mother loved my father more, but it was your father and mother's actions that ruined all these lives. You have to know the truth, Ellen Jorth." The years of hate had finally taken their toll. It seemed as though nothing could save them now. Blood would have to be spilled. The Jorths and the Vandeweghes could not coexist on the same land. "You need to know the truth because the worst of this will fall on you and me," he warned, but her hatred only grew stronger as he spoke. "Never, Colin Vandeweghe," she exclaimed. "I'll never listen to anything you have to say. I won't share anything with you, not even hell." Vandeweghe got off his horse and stood in front of her, still holding onto the reins. The horse snorted and shook his head. "Why do you hate me so much?" he asked. "I'm just my father's son. I've never done anything to harm you or your people. I met you and fell in love with you in an instant, although I didn't realize it at the time. Why do you hate me so much?" Ellen felt a heavy weight in her chest. "You're a Vandeweghe," she spat. "Don't talk to me about love." "I wasn't trying to," he said, "but your hatred seems unnatural. We'll probably never see each other again, but I can't help it. I love you, Colin Vandeweghe and Ellen Jorth. It's strange, isn't it? It was all so strange. Meeting you when I was so lonely and unhappy, seeing you so sweet and beautiful, thinking you were so good despite everything." "That's right," she interrupted, laughing scornfully. "Thinking I was so good despite everything. And I said I'd been kissed before." "In spite of everything," he insisted. Ellen couldn't bring herself to look at him as he towered over her. Her heart was racing. She wanted to say something, anything, but all that came out was a lie. "Yes, I've been kissed before I met you and since," she said mockingly. "I ain't buying into your idea of love, Colin Vandeweghe," Ellen scoffed. "You can laugh all you want, but to me it's something honorable and sweet," Colin replied, his tone serious. Ellen couldn't believe what she was hearing. She was filled with pain, shame, and hate. "You must be different from what I thought," she spat out. Colin's voice was husky as he said, "If I wasn't, I'd make myself different. Now, Miss Ellen, I suggest you get on with your day." Ellen felt a sense of relief wash over her as Colin dismissed her. She looked up at him, half-veiled eyes hiding her true emotions. She knew something was coming, and Colin's changed demeanor only confirmed it. "That's a mighty fine horse you got there," Ellen said, trying to make small talk. Colin nodded. "Yes, he is. Do you like him?" Ellen's voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, "I love him." "Well, then he's yours," Colin said, surprising Ellen. "He'll have an easier life with you than he would with me. I've got some tough rides ahead of me." Ellen couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're giving him to me?" she asked incredulously. Colin nodded. "He's mine, and I want him to have a good home. I picked him out of a group of horses my father owned. My sister Anne rode him a lot. He was stolen from our pasture 2 days ago, and I tracked him all the way up here." Ellen was stunned. "You tracked him all the way here?" Colin nodded. "It wasn't hard. I wish it hadn't been necessary, though." Ellen didn't know what to say. Colin's gesture was unexpected, and she was grateful for it. She watched as Colin whistled for his horse, Spades. The horse came running towards him, and Colin petted him affectionately. "I hope he brings you joy," Colin said, turning back to Ellen. "He deserves a good home." Ellen nodded, still in shock. She watched as Colin rode off into the distance, Spades by his side. She knew that her life would never be the same again. "For me?" she repeated, the words dripping with a hint of sarcasm. Clearly her tone irked Vandeweghe to no end. He misunderstood her intentions and roughly pushed her head back to get a better look at her face. "Yes, for you," he snapped harshly. "Don't you have the sense to see that? What kind of game are you playing with me?" "What game?" she asked innocently. "Any game to fool a decent man," he spat back. Ellen remained silent, her face a mask of blankness. This only served to further enrage Vandeweghe. "You know your father is a horse thief," he bellowed. Ellen's expression remained unchanged. She had been bracing herself for this exact blow. Outwardly she remained stoic, but inside her world was crumbling. "Ellen Jorth, you know your father is in cahoots with the Hash-Knife gang of rustlers," Vandeweghe continued. "And you know he's got this Daggs character leading his faction against the Vandeweghes." "Yes, I know," she replied coolly, her Texan drawl dripping with defiance. "And you know this whole sheepmen versus cattlemen feud is just a cover-up?" "Yep," she confirmed, unflinching under his piercing gaze. Vandeweghe seemed to be at a loss for words, his anger spent. He appeared ready to end the conversation, but was inexplicably drawn to Ellen's unwavering demeanor. His face was a mask of confusion and chaos as he shook his head and clutched at his chest. "I can't believe I fell for someone like you," he exclaimed, his other hand gesturing helplessly in despair. Ellen's body, mind, and soul were now consumed by the hell Vandeweghe had hinted at. She was disgraced and scorned by a Vandeweghe, yet loved by him. This realization ignited a wild, fierce passion within her to hurt, to tear apart, to inflict a stinging agony upon him. Her thoughts lashed out like whips. The pride of the Yorths, the old Texan blue blood, lay dead at her feet, killed by the scornful words of the last remaining member of the family that had caused her degradation. She was the daughter of a horse thief and rustler, dark and grim, accepting her fate, damning her enemies, and staying true to the blood of the Yorths. The sins of the father must be visited upon the daughter. "You could have had me that day on the rim if you hadn't revealed your name," she said mockingly, gazing into his eyes with all the mystery of a woman's nature. Vandeweghe's powerful frame shook as if with an ague. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I would have been fond of having you make up to me," she drawled. The fact that he couldn't help loving her now possessed her with an irresistible power. Some fiendish woman's satisfaction dwelt in her consciousness of her ability to kill the noble, faithful, and good in him. "Ellen Jorth, you're lying," he burst out hoarsely. "Colin, I had been a toy and a rag for these rustlers long enough. I was tired of them. I wanted a new lover, and if you hadn't given yourself away—" Vandeweghe moved so swiftly that she didn't realize his intention until his hard hand smacked her mouth and she tasted the hot, salty blood from her cut lip. "Shut up, you hussy," he ordered roughly. "Don't you have any shame? My sister Anne spoke highly of you. She made excuses for you." Ellen was already struggling to maintain her composure, and this comment was the final blow that almost broke her. "Colin Vandeweghe, go along with you," she said impatiently. "I'm waiting here for Sim Bruce." Finally, Ellen's words hit Vandeweghe hard. Despite his passion and jealousy, he had doubts about himself and an unwavering faith in her. Ellen's inherent subtlety had prompted the speech that tortured Vandeweghe, and the shock of it rebounded on her. She gasped as he lunged for her too quickly for her to react. His arm wrapped tightly around her like a steel band, while the other pressed hard against her breast and neck, forcing her head back. She struggled to break free, but she was powerless against his strength. His dark face loomed closer and closer until she was paralyzed with fear. Despite her terror, Ellen welcomed death if he meant to harm her. "Ellen Jorth, I'm still thinking you're lying," he said lowly and tensely between his teeth. "No, no," she screamed wildly. Her nerve broke, and she could no longer meet his terrible black eyes. Her passionate denial was not only the last of her shameful deceit, it was a repudiation of herself and him and the entire miserable situation. Vandeweghe took her at her word, and the moment held nothing but blank horror for Ellen. "By God, then I'll have something of you anyway," he muttered thickly. Ellen saw the blood bulge in his powerful neck and his dark, hard face come closer and closer until it blurred and obstructed her vision. She felt the swell and ripple and stretch of his enormous muscles like huge coils of elastic rope, binding her tightly. Ellen Jorth was caught off guard as Vandeweghe forcefully kissed her. She felt like she was suffocating and her senses were reeling. It was a terrible and acute consciousness that she couldn't shake off. His kisses were burning and painful, and she felt like a huge bat had fastened onto her throat. Suddenly he let go, and she saw him stagger back with his piercing gaze on her. Vandeweghe's face had been dark purple, but now it was white. "No, Ellen Jorth," he panted. "I don't want any of you that way." He sank on the log and covered his face with his hands. "What I loved in you was what I thought you were." Ellen Jorth sprang upon him like a wildcat, beating him with her fists, tearing at his hair and scratching his face. She was blinded by fury, and Vandeweghe didn't move to stop her. She eventually swayed back from him, shaking so much that she could hardly stand. "You damned Vandeweghe!" she gasped with hoarse passion. "You insulted me." "Insulted you?" laughed Vandeweghe in bitter scorn. "It couldn't be done." "Oh, I'll kill you," she hissed. Vandeweghe stood up and wiped the red scratches on his face. "Go ahead, there's my gun," he said, pointing to his saddle sheath. "Somebody's got to begin this Jorth-Vandeweghe feud. It'll be a dirty business. I'm sick of it already. Kill me. First blood for Ellen Jorth." Ellen Jorth stared at Vandeweghe's gun, feeling overwhelmed by the situation. The dark, grim tide that had engulfed her soul cooled and receded, leaving her without its false strength. As the voices of her enemies retreated, they whispered, "Kill him." However, Ellen Jorth was powerless and still felt trapped in Colin Vandeweghe's strong grasp. "I want to kill you," she whispered to him, "but I can't. Just leave me." "You're not a Jorth, and I'm not a Vandeweghe. We shouldn't be mixed up in this mess," he said solemnly. "I feel sorrier for you than I do for myself. You're just a girl. You used to have a good mother and a decent home. The life you've had here, as mean as it's been, is nothing compared to what you'll face now. Damn the men who brought you here. I'm going to kill some of them." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away. Ellen called out to him to take his horse, but he didn't stop or look back. She called out again, but her voice was weak, and Vandeweghe was already trotting away. Slowly, she leaned against a tree and watched him disappear into the trees. It was a strange relief for Ellen, as if he had taken something of hers with him. She felt a dull pain in her head, and when she looked down, she saw blood on her hands. Vandeweghe's blood. Was it an omen? She sank lower against the tree, closing her eyes. Old John Sprague didn't return, and Ellen lay there for hours, hiding from the sky and sunlight. Eventually the despair and misery wore off, and she began to think coherently. What had she learned? The sight of Vandewege's black horse grazing nearby prompted her to think of the answer. Spades belonged to Colin Vandewege. He had been taken by her father or one of his partners in crime. Vandewege was known for his tracking skills and had lived up to his reputation. Ellen's father was not just a horse thief, but also a rustler who pretended to be a sheepman. He was associated with Daggs, the head of the notorious Hash Knife Gang. Ellen remembered the bad reputation the gang had when she was living in Texas years ago. Her father had joined the gang to get rid of the Vandeweges, who had been a thorn in his side for a long time. Everything now made sense to Ellen. "I am the daughter of a horse thief and rustler," she muttered to herself. Her mind went back to her childhood, and she realized that only the early years had been happy. In light of Vandewege's revelation, all the moves her family had made, the sudden changes in fortune, and their final journey to Arizona, now had a clear meaning. Her father had always been crooked, and her mother knew it. He had destroyed her, and that was the cause of her death. Ellen felt sorrow and anger towards her father. She wondered if Cito Vandewege had played a role in her father's downfall. She hated the Vandeweges, but still felt the need to be fair and weigh the evidence. She knew she had to be true to herself and be on the right side of justice. It was important to her to have the Yorth's creed on her side, but she wasn't one of them. "But I'm not," she said aloud. "My name's Jorth, and I reckon I have bad blood," she muttered to herself. "But it never showed itself till today. I've been honest, I've been good, just like my mother taught me to be, but my pride made me a fool, and now do I have a choice to make? I'm a Yorth. I have to stick to my father." As she pondered her predicament, she felt a pang in her chest. What had she done that day? The answer hit her like a hammer. In a fit of shame and hate, she had perjured herself. She had sworn away her honor and made herself vile. She had hurt the man who loved her deeply. The realization was too much to bear. Yes, he loved her. It was a strange and unbearable truth. She was no longer fighting against her father's disgrace or Colin Vandewege's presence. She was fighting with her own soul. Why had she done such a monstrous thing? To hurt Vandewege as he had hurt her. But that was base. She couldn't have sunk so low if it wasn't for the tremendous turmoil she was in. What had she done to herself? She had caused Vandewege great injury, but she had hurt herself even more. She couldn't forget the way he had defended her honor against those vile men in Greaves's store, the way he had beaten Bruce for defiling her name, and how he had stubbornly denied her own insinuations. She was a woman now, and she understood the complexity of a woman's heart. She had learned a great lesson, but it was too late to fix the damage she had done. Nature couldn't be changed, and Ellen's passionate being thrilled at the manhood of her defender. But even as she thrilled, she acknowledged her hate. The contention between them caused a pang in her breast. "And now what's left for me?" murmured Ellen, not fully analyzing the significance of her query. The most incalculable of the day's disclosures was the wrong she had done herself. "I'm done for one way or another. I must stick to Dad, or kill myself." Ellen rode Spades back to the ranch, moving like the wind. As she swung out of the trail into the open meadow in plain sight of the ranch, her appearance created a commotion among the loungers before the cabin. She rode Spades at a full run. "Who's after you?" yelled her father as she pulled the black to a halt. Jorth held a rifle. Daggs, Jordan, and the other Yorths were there, likewise armed and all watchful, strung with expectancy. "No one's after me," replied Ellen. "Can't I run a horse around here without being chased?" Jorth appeared both incensed and relieved. "What do you mean, girl, running like a streak right down on us? You're acting queer these days, and you look queer. I'm not liking it." "Reckon these are queer times for the Yorths," replied Ellen sarcastically. "Daggs found strange horse tracks crossing the meadow," said her father, "and that worried us. Someone's been snooping around the ranch, and when we saw you running so wild, we sure thought you were being chased." "No, I was only trying out Spades to see how fast he could run," returned Ellen. "Reckon when we do get chased, it'll take some running to catch me." "Haw, haw," roared Daggs. "It sure will, Ellen." "Girl, it's not only your running and your looks that's queer," declared Jorth in dark perplexity. "You talk queer." "Sure, Dad, you're not used to hearing Spades called Spades," said Ellen as she dismounted. "Humph," grunted Ellen's father, as if he had given up on trying to understand women. "Hey, did you see any strange horse tracks?" "I sure did, and I know who made them," Ellen replied calmly. Jorth and the other men behind him became tense. "Who?" Jorth demanded. "Colin Vandaway, for sure. He came up here tracking his black horse," Ellen explained. "Colin Vandaway tracking his black horse," her father repeated. "Yes, he's definitely not overrated as a tracker." There was a moment of silence, and then Ellen began to loosen the cinches of her saddle. Jorth cursed, and Daggs let out a sardonic laugh. "Well, boss, what did I tell you?" he drawled. Jorth strode over to Ellen and grabbed her, turning her to face him. "Did you see Vandaway?" he demanded. "Yes," Ellen replied sharply. "Did you talk to him?" "Yes." "What did he want up here?" "I told you.